Mr. Speaker, this motion is long overdue. Mr. Speaker, in this country, the problem we have is we have what you call an elite capture of the economy of the country itself. And the elite I'm talking about is none other than the political elite from the word go. Mr. Speaker, Kenya Power used to be a government parastatal, KPLC, and did such a fantastic job initially, fully owned by the government, with a few others, very, very few strategic investors at some stage. But later on, the political elite who basically controlled this country opened it up for privatization in line with what was called the SAPs, the Structural Adjustment Program, some times back. And the architects of the Structural Adjustment Programs were basically what you call the first world and the donor community. The idea was that when the continent got independence and the African did not have the capital necessary for the black people in this continent to engage in business, and all these things were controlled by foreigners, the government had to create the parastatals that were going to protect both the consumers as well as protect the system of the day. When they brought in the structural adjustment programs, was basically to try and take back all these corporations so that we become dependent on them and the multinationals can come to our countries and take over our economies. Our elite was even smarter than that. They began taking over those strategic companies themselves. Mr. Speaker, if you go to the UK, the British telephone BT can never be privatized. It's always government owned. The British Railways is always government owned. You cannot take away such strategic institutions or sectors of the economy as power, as what they call the railroad, as telephone communications, and privatize it. Those are supposed to be run by government parastatals. Now that we privatized it, the elite went further. And they began now bringing in what you call the independent power producers to be able to deal with the demand for more power, for industrialization, and other economic developments we needed in the country. And they got into these contracts with Kenya Power. And these contracts are one-sided. They are determined, they are dictated, and they are forced by the leaders of this country, the political leaders of this country. Mr. Speaker, if you want to go into politics in the US, you take your property and wealth into a blind trust and you are not allowed to do business anymore. Anywhere in the world, there's something called conflict of interest. This is the only country where you have a minister for finance who also owns a bank or has an interest in bank. This is the only country where you can find somebody in the telecommunications, what they call on the mobile sector, an investor, but also is a regulator in the Ministry of Telecommunications, the Communications Authority. This is the only country where you find people are in a sector which is so critical to the livelihoods of Kenyans that they have the investors in the milling corporations, which is our staple food in the country. The investors in the milk sector, and they also run the country, they control the country. Mr. Speaker, this has got to stop. And none of us knows who owns these IPPs, what they call the independent power producers. That is how Kenya Airways was destroyed. We had what was called the East African Airways. The political elite destroyed the East African community, not because they wanted something more for Kenyans, but they wanted something more for themselves. And we remember those political elites of those days. Most of you are very young people and can't remember, but I remember myself in 1997 because I was a grown-up person there. 77. Mr. Speaker, we have to take back our country and give it back to Kenyans. We don't have to liberate ourselves and get independence from a foreigner we have to get independence from the state capture by the political elite from day one who have taken over this country. I know you are a member of the so-called Hustler movement in this country. If you don't do some of these things, if you don't deal with these things very firmly and effectively, if you don't come to this house and this country with a proper land reforms, we have 20 million acres of land that were grabbed by the political elite of the day that can be given now to 10 million Kenyans or 5 million Kenyans, and that can be a very powerful means of production. It is not there. It is not there. If you are not going to do that, you're going to say that they just needed this so that they can capture power and go back to business as usual. And Kenyans of yesterday and the Kenyans of today are different. If you don't tame these people, you don't tame right now, go back to Kenya KQ, find out how Kenya KQ was bankrupted the way it is. And tell us so and so, who was a minister, who was the deputy president, who was the president, who God knows whatever he was, is the one responsible for this, what do you call, a mess in the place. And we go back as Kenyans and say, bring back that money. The same thing also with the IPPs. How do you contract IPPs? And the only thing they are supposed to do is that you are not paying them for consumption, you are paying them for capacity. You are paying them for capacity. Mr. Speaker, this country, I was a young man when the East African community was coming down, and we were told Kenya is a man-eat-man society. We have been a man-eat-man society for far too long, for over 60 years. If we're not careful, those people out there, those Kenyans, 67% of them who cannot get 3 square meals in a day. The poor Kenyans who are professionals, who are technocrats, who are working in all the sectors in this country, but cannot afford to pay for the power today. They can't send their children to good schools. Because we privatized everything. The elite went into education. I grew up in this country when the best schools were the government schools. Today, we don't have that. Because the political elite of the day invested in education, destroyed the public sector, improved what they call the private sector. I grew up in this country when my own dad in 1966, when this place was called King George, just changed the name that time, Kenyatta National Hospital, had an accident and he stayed there for 3 months. And it was one of the best, literally the best medical facility in the country. The political elite went into the health sector. They have gone into the health sector. Because they went into the health sector, that's why we have problems in the public sector in terms of health. Until such a time that the individual Kenyan can get, Mr. Speaker, can I plead with you to give me just 2 more minutes? Okay, thank you very much. Until such a time that you can go into a public health sector and get better services than Nairobi Hospital, Al Khan Hospital, MP Shah, until such a time that we do not have any meaningful independence in this country. Go to the US, UK. Go to UK today. The NHS is the best health facility in that country. The National Health Services, financed and owned by the British government. Every person, every Briton, and I want to report that Babu Owino to listen to this later. Every Briton, regardless of what the state is able to get services as good as the minister in the House of Commons gets. Yes. Am I off? Why am I off? Oh, this thing has gone bad.
But a small issue with the system today, so it isn't that you've been cut off.
You want me to come here? I used to use this when I was in the 10th Parliament. This place is no longer there. Now, how do we do this now? Somebody help me. Okay. Yeah, it's just too short. This is the problem with this place. You haven't taken into consideration mass size and so much. Mr. Speaker, and lose, of course. Mr. Speaker, An ordinary Briton gets this. An ordinary Briton gets the same services as the minister in the House of Commons gets. That country is richer than us. They have a GDP that is, God knows how many times, 100 times, 150 times bigger than our own GDP. We are a poor country. If our children can't get education, the poor children can't get education. We can't get health. We can't get food. What is this country going to be? J.M. Kariuki said Kenya is a country of 10 millionaires and 10 million poor people. Mr. Speaker, we must deal with all this. We must deal with every sector of this country that affects our economy. A country cannot develop unless there are four fundamental things. Power, cheap power. Water and sanitation that is available to everybody and cheap. And a transport network. We don't have any of those ones. We might have achieved something, but we are way below the capacity. When countries like Singapore were poorer than us, when South Korea came to beg us here, Mr. Speaker, it is my humble. Let us save this country from
what is the fourth one?
The fourth one. I said power, water and sanitation, and transport network.
Water and sanitation and water are one.
Yeah, no. And our people are using flying toilets. You know, you go now to the Babu Owino knows where he comes from and where he represents. People use plastics to become toilets and throw them away. We have a health problem. Our children, Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for our children. All of us are feeding on sewers. Our rivers are dead. This is a nation that is on a deathbed. Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for allowing me to say this, but we must tame this. This has got to be tamed in every sector, the banking sector, finance sector, what do you call the energy sector, the water sector, every sector, the road sector, education in this country must be saved and must be given back to Kenyans. Otherwise, we'll end up with a revolution one day.
Thank you, Honorable Farah. This chance goes to the member for Kirinyaga. Members on this side, I've just given 3 in a row from this side. So don't put pressure on me at all. I'll follow what I have there. I've given 3 in a row from this side. So